So on today's show, we've got Adrian Colyer, and Adrian currently works as a venture partner for Accel, but previously he held CTO roles with SpringSource, VMware, and Pivotal. And in addition to an incredible working career, Adrian writes a blog, The Morning Paper, something that we are massive fans of here at HashiCorp. In my humble opinion, the work that Adrian has done with Spring has really helped to shape the direction of software development and the modern software systems architecture, and I find it incredibly exciting to be able to talk to him today. And Adrian, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
And we've got some great questions. And I think one of the things that I and Mishra always like to do is kind of dig a little bit into your sort of educational background to try and learn a little bit about what brought you to where you are right now. And so I have a question for you. Now, I'm not going to ask how old you are, but I have been doing some snooping on the internet, and I did look at when you graduated. And you're actually a pretty similar age to me. Can you talk to us about your first introduction to computing and sort of some early memories and things like that?
Yes, of course. So it definitely will date me. So my first computer was a Christmas present, and it was a ZX Spectrum, with the one with the little rubber keys, for those of you that remember that. And my earliest memories actually were, at that time there were sort of hobbyist magazines, and they would have, because there wasn't really any software that came with the computer especially, they would have listings in them that you could type in to get it to do very simple things. Like I remember trying to get an animated tank to move across the screen. And actually the very first ones, you typed in the assembly code, not the assembly instructions, but you typed in the hexadecimal strings. And I remember being so excited to eventually get my hands on I think it was a BBC Electron, because it had a built-in assembler, and I thought that was just the coolest thing. So that was kind of the beginnings, just doing very, very humble things very slowly and sort of picking my way up from the bytes upwards.
Would that have been Sinclair User back then, the magazine?
Quite possibly, yes, yeah.
I think I've got very fond memories of those days as well. And from that sort of early, those early experiences of playing around with computing, what inspired you to study computer science?
So I guess, I mean, even though it was really simple, and I graduated to basic, if you could say that, I would write these really simple like adventure games that were just a horrific, massive nested if-else statements and all sorts of things. But you could mold it, you could shape it, you could make it do things that back then kind of seemed impressive, even though they were really basic. And I sort of love that kind of creative sense to it and being able to shape something, and got fascinated about how the whole thing worked. I remember the thing sounds really quite sad. The thing I was super excited about the degree course that I eventually chose was that they showed you, I think it was operating systems and compilers, and just like those are the only really things that I'd, beyond the pre-canned game, that I'd engage with. It like that sort of was a computer to me, the operating system and then the language. Like, well, if you teach me how to make those things, then like that's really magical, it seemed to me, and I was really keen to learn about that.
I love the fact that so many people are influenced from gaming and sort of the early influences of computing to then fulfill a career. So every parent out there who's kind of looking at their kids and saying, hey, shouldn't be playing games, nothing will amount of that. I think there's proof in pudding that it does lead to good things. Just back onto the kind of the sort of the education, because I think a lot of the things that folks look at these days is the cost of education. And certainly when I went to university, it was a lot less, to the point that of educational grants to not only pay your fees, but to pay living expenses. Did you have a similar sort of situation?
I think I might have been the very last year not to be part of what in the UK was the student loan system. So in other words, I could get a grant and have not just my tuition fees, but sort of basic living expenses paid. The year after me, I think a couple of years after me, that didn't happen, and there were student loans. So yeah, I was one of the last to come through, and I did need it. I needed that financial support to be able to do it.
I think it was a wonderful thing, and I think what the question I was kind of leading to as well is that, do you think that if sort of circumstances had changed, if you didn't have that capability, do you think you would have still gone away to university?
if I didn't have the like an external source of funding, as it were, I mean, I don't know. If you look at the scale of debt that a student leaves with, which can be like on the order of £60,000, obviously we're talking a while ago, so it would have been proportionally less, but depending on the mechanism, I would have felt uncomfortable about that. I would have thought really hard, for sure. Yeah. I mean, maybe now we've had many years of getting used to students repaying it, and it's become more normative. But it's a huge thing to leave, hanging around your neck.
I suppose I was kind of like, what do you feel about the worth of it, though? Is the sense of the benefit that you've had out of that, and I suppose this is the key thing, right?
Yeah. So yes, at the time I would have been very wary of it, but looking back, of course, I'd do it every single time. It was great fun doing the degree, and I learned a ton. But like most of these things, it was what unlocked the next step, and that's really without going to the university and getting the degree, I wouldn't have been able to take the next step, and then nothing that followed would have followed probably.
Do you have any kind of takeaways where you think, the thing I learned in a computer science class is the same thing that a principle that I apply today?
I think you take inspiration from a few teachers. I mean, I remember one lecturer. I mean, these are those, like a lecturer called Dave DeRoy, who was brilliant, and he'd done all sorts of Lispy things, and I really enjoyed his classes. Maybe you take a belief in yourself. If I really like, hey, I can do these things and I can study them. Some of those principles have perhaps followed through. A lot you learn later. But the belief that you can study and master things and enjoy it, etc., that was planted in me, I think, then. So that's been hugely valuable. And
we all know that it did lead to sort of bigger and better things. And let's kind of look at the first sort of step there. So I believe your first step from leaving university was a career at IBM.
Yeah.
How did that start? Was it a sort of a career graduate fair, or sort of did you directly apply to the company?
What I remember, I suppose, what I remember at that time when I was graduating, there was a recession. There were hardly any jobs around, so maybe there was a recruitment fair. It was certainly. I mean, IBM were a known employer in the area, so I went to university in Southampton. There's a big IBM Hersley sort of research and development site, kind of like just up the road, employing 1,000+ people, whatever. So it's an obvious known big employer in the area. They probably sponsored some prizes at the university or whatever. I feel that. So there was kind of like a connection with them as an obvious employer. The thing I remember at the time was there were basically no sort of permanent jobs anywhere, and I went to IBM solely because they offered me a 4-year fixed-term contract, and I thought I've probably got more chances of 4 years of work, kind of on that arrangement at this point in time, than going in as a permanent employee and being kind of, first in, first out if times get tough. And obviously I converted from like a fixed term contract to a permanent employee after a while. But
well, you spent 13 years there, I think. I mean, I hope my mathematics is correct on that. So you must have enjoyed it. And I want to kind of touch on one of the things which, again, I hope my research is correct, but it was at IBM where you first started to look at Aspect J.
Yes, it was. Yeah, absolutely. So sort of my IBM path was like a real grounding in sort of classic, I guess, middleware at the time, transaction processing, messaging systems. That's the time that Java first came into being, etc. I worked on a platform called CICS, or CICS as the Americans like to call it as well, many things. While I was working on CICS, that was kind of what we call now an application server, I guess. It's a mainframe application server, and it did many of the things that you think of as a modern application server. It had the transactions and all the rest of it. And we were looking at, in that kind of thinking about sort of the programming model of how you'd write an application and how sort of the application connected to the underlying application server. And I think because I had that kind of ideas in my head, what I actually saw was a research paper. No, not even a paper. I went to a conference. I went to ICSI. I think ICSI 2000. Actually, ironically, I was presenting a paper there, which was called From Research to Reward, Challenges in Technology Transfer, or something like that, talking about how we took work out of IBM research and kind of tried to find places to apply it. So I was there for that reason, and there was a paper presented by somebody called Gregor Kixalis, and the title was Aspect-Oriented Programming, and I literally just thought, That's a really interesting name. I don't know what that is, but it sounds kind of interesting. I should go check it out. And it was one of those moments for me where you see a new idea or a new technology and it just instantly connects with you. And I think it connected because what I was seeing, here's a really interesting way that it says the core of an application could connect to or bind to a piece of middleware and describe its transactionality and its security and its persistence and its logging and all these other attributes that back then we were doing with really horrific, I guess it was XML in that first generation. Here's a much more elegant way of expressing it. And these aspect things feel like they neatly encapsulate this. And so that was my first hook. Eventually I got talking to that team who'd been running a project out of Park, actually, Xerox Park. I was like, my pitch to my boss essentially was, hey, there's a team at Xerox Park who've got this brilliant idea and they don't know what to do with it. Maybe we should pick it up and run with it. And the team building AspectJ were super kind to me. They kind of embraced me, and we collaborated together. Eventually, they decided the best way for AspectJ to go forward was to open source it. When they open sourced it, I kind of took over the leadership of the project and took it forward from the day of open sourcing onwards. And I incubated all of that during my time at IBM, and then sort of moved on fairly shortly afterwards. But that was the genesis of it.
I mean, I could have looked at this around the timing, as you said, sort of starting around 2000 when you first saw the paper. But specifically, I found an article which you'd written back in 2005. And there was one thing that literally jumped out of the page at me, was that you mentioned and you quoted Eric Evans on domain-driven design. And I looked at this and I was like, hang on a minute. Adrian is talking about Eric Evans and domain-driven design in 2005. I remember looking at this maybe even 2015 and thinking these were really sort of revolutionary concepts. But what I found was evidently apparent that even back 2005, you were deeply thinking about how systems are composed and potentially how they interact and how they're decoupled. Was there a kind of a primary motivation around that? Was it based on the work that you'd done with Kix and how that you developed something larger?
That took me to AspectJ, but really that was at the heart of it. So for those who don't know, AspectJ and an aspect-oriented programming language is all about really saying, look, when you build a system, there are these things, we call them cross-cutting concerns that kind of like, if you were to write a design document, they'd be one chapter, one paragraph in the design document, and it would say something like sort of, all the services at this layer are transactional, blah, blah, blah. This is how transactions work. And what would happen in many code bases is you'd have that one coherent concept in the design, and it would end up scattered across large bits of the code base. So that's why we called it a cross-cutting concern, right? And so the thing you had to think deeply about in the AspectJ context in order to build the language and grow the community was like, well, how do we make that modular? How do we make that, like you say, how do we make the code look like the design? If it's one conceptual thing in the design, how can it be one conceptual module in the code? And what does all that entail? Which leads you to thinking about, well, what is a module, and how do we design our system, and all those kind of classic PAR-NAS papers. And so that's the kind of the thread that took me into all of those places. And obviously we knew Eric Evans as kind of a friend of the SpringSource team and his wonderful work, and very much enjoyed kind of talking with him and working with him over the years.
I mean, I'm a big believer in domain-driven design, and I think domain-driven design is the thing that a lot of people haven't realized that they need right now. I think it's something which is a lot of folks will naturally kind of center around when they're trying to sort of build their teams and their organization around microservices. But I literally find it mind-blowing that Eric Evans was able to think around those topics back when systems were a number of interconnected systems rather than tens or hundreds of connected systems. It's a brilliant piece of work.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those sort of few books you can look at over the years. That was a real kind of landmark that changed things. There's before and after kind of Eric Evans's DDD, and that it shaped the way a lot of us think.
Vernon Vaughan as well was very, very popular in Last Job. We were big fans. I think Vernon does some great work to kind of take things along and maybe make a little more accessible or around some of the sort of the concepts. But brilliant work. What you mentioned earlier about AspectJ and open source. Now, again, like for me, open source in 2005 just wasn't a thing. It was that's pretty forward thinking. How did that come about? What was what were the drivers around that? How did you spot that?
My first foray into open source was accidental because I'd attached myself to Aspect-J, and like the Park had some IP and some code that was internal, and they wanted to find a way to give it a future, and open source looked like a good solution. Now, of course, the minute I got into it, well, then that like changed my world. So all of a sudden, and you're right, I mean, it was super early, especially for the enterprise, but things again that we take for granted now, like the incredibly rich, fast feedback loop that you can have in developing software in a tight loop with its users, etc. But completely revolutionary. I mean, if you think about like a classic IBM style product development, certainly of its time, you might work on something for 18 months, 2 years, and then you release it, and then gradually customers use it, and sort of 3 years after you design something, you might possibly hear some feedback about whether it was any good. With open source, that could compress down to like half an hour or something. So your ability to refine and improve and get in that feedback loop was just astounding. So.
And I think that causes you, or in some ways forces you to reevaluate the way that you build systems. So we tend to move towards a more componentized approach rather than a sort of a large contribution to a single entity. Where were the Spring influences coming from then? So, because this is obviously a major pivotal movement in software development.
Yeah, so connecting the bridge to Spring. So I'm working on Aspect-J, I'm the project lead, and around that time there were a set of conferences like the server side, for example, that had become a bit of a circuit for a certain subset of people. Lots of interesting things grew out of that circuit. And it turned out that often I was on the same panel speaking at the same events as this person called Rod Johnson, who had this fledgling thing called the Spring Framework. And a very interesting thing happened again. So like we started talking to each other, and it wasn't an obvious connection. We both realized that we'd sort of found, as we knew it at that point in time, the one other person in the world who actually had a similar kind of vision about the way enterprise applications and the middleware and the services that they use should be bound together. And like Rod had a key part of the problem, with the dependency injection and with some of the other things that were in Spring. And frankly, Aspects had a different part of the problem, which is like, well, how should you do these transactions and the security and some other things? And so like, you put all this together and you get this really nice kind of composite that solves the collected problems. And gradually we got to know each other, and I took the leap and I left IBM and sort of, it was called Interface 21 at the time, but so hooked up with Rod and the team, and that was the beginning of the SpringSource journey.
Which was incredible success, because you actually took an open source product and not only kind of made it a very, very popular, and still is probably, I would say, one of the most widely used software development frameworks. But you turned a company out of this. I mean, you actually managed to make a successful business from this wonderful tool. How did that sort of work? Was that by accident or by design?
Yeah, it was by design in the intent. The way it was actually realized, obviously there's a lot of learning on the way. Now we're used to kind of like HashiCorp, companies that make really big, great businesses and are open source at the core. For the longest time, and in fact, it's still fairly recently, people didn't really sort of think that was a wide-scale usable model. I mean, the genesis of SpringSource, as a commercial entity, was actually a group of really smart people who were contributing to the open source project and also generally doing consultancy. So that they were primarily sort of consultants who were actually building enterprise applications and using Spring to do it, finding they loved that way so much that they were contributing back to the code base. And Rod was leading that, and obviously Jürgen Höhler was another super key figure. And that group kind of came together and formed this genesis of a company that began sort of monetizing as a group through consulting, and then developed training, which is great because you can have one person sort of teach a whole class all at once, and then sort of through this whole journey of, is there developer support, is there production support, and then gradually kind of growing into lines of business beyond just the Court Spring framework. So, we had a business around Apache Tomcat, we had Hyperic and system management. We eventually further down lines of business around Redis and around RabbitMQ and sort of. So it was really there's one thing sort of defines that sort of 15-year period of my career. It was generally, hey, we've got this wildly successful open source project. Now, how do we make money out of it? That's kind of the question on which many cycles have been spelt, and there's no simple answer. But.
Well, I'm very pleased that you did, and I think it's a wonderful framework, and I think on behalf of millions, I am sure, sort of really thank you for the work that you and the team put. So let's look at next steps, because after the success of Spring Cloud and Spring, you moved on to VMware and a little product which a few people will have heard of, which is Cloud Foundry. And I think Cloud Foundry was and is as important a project for the way that we kind of think about developing and interacting with the software development process. Where did the ideas come from? Like, can I be kind of a little cheeky and suggest that Cloud Foundry was trying to tame the beast that you unleashed with the sort of the microservice approach with Spring Cloud?
So Cloud Foundry actually precedes Spring Cloud a little bit. So the credit for this, and it's a really incredibly visionary move, really goes with Paul Maritz, who was the then CEO of VMware at the time that they acquired SpringSource, and sort of we came in as a division of VMware at the time. And for those that remember, there was a lot of like, are VMware crazy? Why are they doing this? This is a virtualization company. What are they doing buying kind of an application development framework? In the enterprise Java space, like, it doesn't make any sense. But Paul had a vision, and he had this vision that kind of like developers were going to become increasingly important, and that because they were kind of the initial contact point, they had a very large sway over what technology choices were made from then on downwards. And of course, we call that like the shift left phenomenon on developers as kingmakers, etc. But Paul believed this enough that he was prepared to spend a sizable amount of money buying a company, essentially because Spring had this amazing developer audience and interaction with it, in the belief that VMware would ultimately need something that kind of connected to developers on down. At the same time as that happened, incubated inside of VMware, and we met Mark Lukowski and Derek Collison within the first few days inside of VMware. They had a really fledgling project called Cloud Foundry that was kind of like, well, we also think there's going to be sort of something at what we now call like the PaaS layer that sits above kind of virtualization that should go with this application programming model. And the vision was there then of all those pieces. And it took us years to actually kind of assemble, grow it, unlock it, and put it all together. The creation of Pivotal was another actually key step in that journey. So it's like, well, you can see that there's this massive opportunity at the PaaS layer and the application layer. Super hard to realize that full potential inside of VMware with all of the core products, etc. going on. So, again, another sort of move with Paul very much at the helm. We spun out the Pivotal company, and I worked with a wonderful guy called Scott Yara on kind of, we put our heads together trying how could this kind of thing fit together. And really then it was even a couple of years sort of into the Pivotal journey, actually when Pivotal started to try and sell Cloud Foundry, and finally everything kind of clicked organizationally. And it clicked because the sales team were like, the only thing that customers really want to talk to us about is Spring. Spring and the way we build applications is the lead into this platform. And finally, after all those years, kind of Paul's vision had come together. It was like, here's this amazingly powerful developer outreach and platform that has sway, that leads people to a runtime that's best suited to running those applications that maybe could then run, etc. on the VMware stack. So it took many years and actually lots of kind of cultural alignment and shifting and jiggling to get it all to bed, and then sort of eventually it clicked, and that was a very rewarding moment when it all came together.
I think it was a wonderful success, and I think it was attributable to that kind of triumvirate of things that you had, the software development framework, the software development platform. But I think one of the wonderful things that Pivotal as an organization did was brought the process. They were kind of really kind of leading this iterative development, this automation approach, this kind of full quality software development, testing everything, to be able to kind of help people drive business value out of the softwares and systems. And I think those three pieces together.
Yeah, I mean, I saw so many times, actually the enterprise sales motion for Pivotal in a number of cases was, what we do is we bring in the most senior folks from the company and we give them a tour of the Pivotal lab, and they actually see firsthand the way that the people are working and the software is being developed and the velocity, etc. And then they go, I want that. And they wanted like the whole thing, the platform, the process, the transformation, etc. It was very visionary for them, and that actually was a huge factor.
But I think one thing that you have to be sort of congratulated on around that as well is that it was beloved by businesses and the people who were developing the software. The developers loved the process. The businesses loved the value that they got from the process. I think it was sort of universally successful across the board there, and some wonderful sort of thought leadership that Pivotal has injected into the industry, which is helping shape the way that we currently develop software.
Rob Mee takes a lot of credit, obviously, for building up Pivotal Labs. Obviously, we took the Pivotal name from Pivotal Labs that had been acquired earlier, and all of that piece of it came from Rob Mee and his team, and yeah, they were great.
Props to them. I think like so far, like it feels like Pivotal's, really was kind of ideal and kind of groundbreaking at what it was doing at that time, and I really appreciated it like over time though, because I think I was only exposed to it super late in my own career. But I would always think that someone should have thought about like something like Cloud Foundry in my jobs, and then I found out there was a Cloud Foundry, and it had already been thought through. So I think that was really exciting for me to know. But I think so. Okay, I want to kind of take a pause. Talk about like a few different aspects of your career, and take a pause, kind of the normal flow, and talk about the most famous thing that I think you're kind of very well known for is the morning paper, right? And I think I'm a personal kind of consumer of it. I know Nick reads it, and a lot of HashiCorp folks that read the morning paper. So my question is like, what prompted you to even start something like that?
A happy accident / piece of luck. The honest confession is I was a sucker for a listicle, is how this all began. Somebody posted somewhere something like 10 computer science papers that every programmer must read. It was some title like that. I really must find out who wrote that. And I kind of was just curious, like, I wonder how many of those I'd always enjoyed kind of reading research. I wonder how many of those I'd read. And some of them I had, a couple of them I hadn't, some of them I hadn't read recently. I was on the train when this happened to me. So I live kind of outside of London. I have about a 1 hour train journey into London, which under normal times is sort of where my office was. Obviously, I've been working from home for quite some time now, but so I had this 1 hour train journey, and I'm sitting there and I'm reading a computer science research paper, and I look around the train carriage, and my fellow passengers are reading like the newspapers, like so in the UK, like the Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian, whatever. And I very flippantly tweeted, this is fine. Like my morning paper is this, and I tweeted kind of the link to the computer science research paper I was reading. I thought, that was quite fun. Let me share a couple of excerpts, and I did it the next day and the next day. And somehow I think I ended up doing 5 papers a week for the first 2 years straight or something after that. And I took little breaks, like end of term, as I called it, like over Christmas and Easter, like I'd have 2 weeks off. But it just kept rolling. First it was tweets. It was like, hey, this is the paper. Here's a couple of thoughts. And then I started having like too many thoughts about the paper, because you probably picked up, I get really excited about this stuff and I want to share it, like, something 6 tweets a day. And a good friend who'd worked with kind of Guillaume Lafour said to me, I really think Adrian should start a blog. And it was his polite way of saying, stop spamming my Twitter feed, basically. But yeah, maybe he's right. And so I flipped it into a blog format, and I put my condensed excerpts, and gradually the format evolved, and sort of, I weakened, and I went down to about 3 papers a week at one point, which is a bit more of a sustainable pace. But that is actually how it all started, in a sort of pure chance. But obviously, once I'm into it, it continued by design. So one of the things that was important to me, because at this point, I literally just moved from Pivotal kind of into the VC world. And that's a bit of a strange thing to do as a pure technical person. This is an interesting leap. And I didn't want to be like the person that used to be the CTO of SpringSource, like how many years can you live on that before it gets really tired and you're irrelevant, etc. And I suddenly realized one of the reasons I'm so enjoying this, beyond just the research, is it's keeping me in a current technical conversation with a group of really interesting peers. And it filled kind of a hole that was created by leaving a purely technical role in my job. And so that's sort of one of the things that helped that really to continue and gave me a lot of value from it.
5 papers a week, Adrian. That's ridiculous. Like I know that, I barely can make through, like, especially with the kind of the language that's used in the academia papers. It's fairly complex and it's very verbose in many places, and it is really hard to grasp kind of the fundamental truth of the paper, what you're trying to get to super easily and in a short period of time. I think that's kind of an interesting skill. So how long, like, I guess my question is, like, how long does it take you to kind of
a very frequently asked question. Yeah, so sort of for a post of the morning paper, it's somewhere around 3 to 3.5 hours of time per post, I think, something like that. Going from kind of like coming in, sort of reading the paper for the first time, trying to distill my thoughts about it, and then sort of write them down and then get it all scheduled. And pretty much like a morning paper post is just a one take. I just sit down and write it, so they're not extensively edited. And I actually, like, you know what, because I do so many, I'm prepared to live with the occasional typo and whatever, that's okay. So when I was commuting, actually the pattern would typically be read the paper on the way into London in the morning, sort of think about it during the walk to the office and have it mulling around in the mind during the day. And then on the train on the way home, sort of really break the back of writing up kind of my thoughts about it. And, sort of different papers have different levels of intensity and depth that you really need to get to. But that was the heart of it. And that's still sort of, even if I'm not on a train, the gist of how I will do it. I'll read the paper through, I'll mark it up, I think about it. I don't think, like, what's the story that this paper is really telling? Why is it interesting to the audience? And then I'll write the post.
That's definitely a unique skill. I'm sure people have told you that before, but it's not that straightforward to do that.
Well, practice helps. So by the time you've done your first 1,000 or so, it does get easier.
So how do you find these papers in the first place? Do you look through a catalog or
a number of ways? So let's sort of, there are several ways into it. So a great way to start that I did as well. I mean, like the 10 great papers every programmer must read. You can go to, for example, the recommended reading lists of computer science courses in areas you're interested in. You can see, like, well, what papers are in the courses? What do they recommend? Maybe this is in some senses a canon that starts to emerge, and so you can start to do that. And then you start to realize, like, well, these are the main conferences that come around in these different areas. And, maybe these are the ones that I like and I feel a bit more affinity to. And so I actually mark up a calendar at the start of the year of when they all are. And I go through their proceedings when they come out, and I try to think, okay, these are the papers that look like, I'll put them on my reading list. Then you start to learn, like, well, here's a research group that, regardless of the conference, does super interesting work. So now let me kind of follow that group, etc. And out of that mix, obviously, and then there's just like, I read a great paper, it's really interesting, and then I follow the references in the back. There's never-ending threads that you can keep following forever. I mean, there's just such a vast expanse of knowledge out there. But so the actual paper selection, and one thing I sort of like to make sure people understand is, like, sort of, sometimes people said, oh, it's sort of like, it's like winning a best paper award if you get in the morning paper. And I mean, it's nice for coverage, but it's really not like winning a best paper award. Because I don't have that, qualified judgment to say that, but also I follow my own interests. I pick a paper that at that time, for whatever thing I research, is the paper that connects to me or speaks to me for some reason. And sort of, so it was interesting and it was serendipitous, but it wasn't like I religiously read all 40 of the papers from the proceedings and selected this as the absolute very best one, so it's...
I'm sure people reach out to you and they're like, hey, you should, read this one and summarize this one, and so on. I'm sure your Twitter DMs are full of, like, folks sending you papers. Yeah,
I have started to get some of the suggestions, and I mean, that's just wonderful. I mean, I love it. If somebody's already said, hey, I read this paper and I loved it, and they send me the link, then I'm always very grateful for those. Yeah, for sure.
So I guess morning paper, like, how does that like, has that helped you in your career? Like, has that given you an edge over, like, I guess other folks? And overall, like, kind of touches to your point earlier when you talked about you venturing into the VC world, and this kind of kept you relevant. So how does that have helped you in I guess in the day-to-day job that you do today?
So again, it's helped me massively, and in ways that, like, I didn't necessarily foresee, but I recognized the patterns and then reinforced them. So one of the things, actually, like, really simple thing is, obviously many startups have very technical co-founders, and sort of quite often I've read or I've written about something that's sort of close-ish to what they're doing. Maybe they've heard of the morning paper. We can build a rapport very quickly. You know, it's perhaps unsurprising, but a founder really loves it if they talk to somebody at an investment firm that actually deeply understands what they do. Now, I don't get the ultimate intricacies of every company I meet, but I can have a meaningful conversation with a technical founder down to a good level, and so it's great for building rapport and for understanding kind of what they're doing. The thing that's interesting is I can never really predict in advance which are the papers that are going to later come up and be useful. So it's not like I'm particularly choosing papers because I think, oh, that will be great in some, conversation with the founder down the line. But so many of them often are. So again, it's really just about having this sort of wide, for this role, a wide, broad brush kind of approach over everything, and then allowing kind of luck to do its thing.
So I guess, talking more about the VC role, and, which is, I guess, you're today, right? So what is it like being a partner who is, I guess, quote unquote, a computer nerd at like a VC firm? Like, how does that work? Like,
so my role is what's called a venture partner, which I informally kind of describe as like a hanger on to the investment team. And so very early on, it's like, but first off, like I started there with what's called EIR, which is like a temporary kind of like, just come and see what's what. And I realized, like, well, hey, this is actually a super interesting vantage point because, so our sort of, for the fund I work with out of London, like we invest in companies out of Europe and Israel. So pretty much if somebody's doing something really interesting in Europe and Israel, starting a business, got some great technology going, I can talk to them and they tell me all about it and they answer any question I have. I mean, how fantastic is that? All the people that you get to meet and the conversations you have and the things you get to learn. So that side of it is absolutely brilliant. That you've got that connection. And then so I realized, well, look, I can try and be like an out and out investor, and I can go down that path and try and become like a senior partner, and I can be responsible for writing the big checks, etc. And I thought, probably I'll be not quite as good as that as like that the more traditional background investors that are in the London firm. And likewise they have a to me incredibly impressive understanding of technology, given that they haven't actually worked in a in a deeply technical role. Some of them have, but certainly for many years. They're never going to be as technical and have that breadth of understanding that I have on that front. I'm not going to go to McKinsey and be a consultant, or go to Harvard, or that kind of. So why don't we be complementary? And so actually that's kind of how it's settled inside of Accel is really, and it's worked really well, is I work alongside the partners. I help with sourcing, I help with diligence, I sit on boards, I help grow companies, but I'm not trying to be the out and out investor. And I think that helped them because they sort of then they understood where I fitted, and it definitely helped me to say actually that's not me, and I'm comfortable with this sort of member of the team, but I don't have to be the the front person on every deal. And so that's sort of how it's been structured.
That's very well balanced, at least from what you've explained. So you do, I guess, end up researching a lot of like future trends and where the industry is going. And I'm sure you're asked this question a lot of times. So where, like in your perspective, where do you feel the industry is kind of trending towards?
Yes, so of course, I mean, as Accel does this thing it calls the prepared mind, which is basically sort of the famous quote, sort of that fortune favors the prepared mind, and so we will go and we'll look in an area, and we'll try and form a thesis about sort of what a winning hand might look like, with the hope that then then we'll search the companies, and hope if we encounter a company or some founders in that space, we can be smart enough to move quickly and with this, and decisively. So that's the theory there. And so we do that kind of work as a team through a whole range of things. And you certainly do. You get to see some of the themes coming through. Now, do we kind of look at like big 5-year horizon things? perhaps not quite that extreme, but we certainly do thematic stuff. For example, the team have recently been going through, actually looking again at a bunch of sort of very developer focused and developer led kind of companies, and looking at some of that. Been looking in again because actually I've been building some of these. I still actually am hands-on in writing code, which is another aspect of the role I really enjoy. And like some of the stuff around actually building robust, solid, mature data pipelines and operating them, etc. Like there's a real hole here that like doesn't seem to be filled. So we've been looking at some of that. We did the obvious kind of like, we spent going back a few years looking at sort of what's happening with AI and machine learning and sort of what kind of things do we like, do we not like, etc. Not an Accel thing, but it really caught my eye in the news recently, like IBM saying like, here's our roadmap to 1,000 qubit quantum computer, for example. I mean, I don't know that's ready for Accel yet, but wow, like what can you do with 1,000 qubits? And actually look at that trend, they're like doubling like Moore's law. So that's kind of cool, and it's going to be a real left field thing that intercepts us at some point.
Yeah, what's surprising to me is that you're still hands-on keyboard. Like I'm sure it surprises a lot of people in the who are viewing this as well.
Yeah, there's a bit of a theme to this. So like, it wasn't really planned. Accel at the time had an internal system that was just terrible, and everybody was complaining about it. And I knew a thing or two about building these web app things, and so I kind of just quickly built a little better front end on top of the old existing system, and sort of it's grown, and now sort of it's called Sorcery, and it's Accel's internal platform for doing kind of top of the funnel sourcing. So sort of can you find some signal in the data that sort of helps the very top of the funnel say, hey, maybe here are some companies that you ought to be looking at. And so it does that, and it streamlines all the processes and practices, etc. And it's oddly enough, I probably do as much, if not more, actual kind of real coding, certainly code that goes into production, than I did when I was wearing a CTO hat at Pivotal, for example, because you really don't get to write much of the product in those kind of roles.
It sort of just highlights that we are talking to a person who absolutely loves what he does, and that you've kind of, I'm guessing that there's not been many sort of second thoughts in all of the kind of the steps throughout your career and to where you're kind of at today.
Yeah, I've chased what interests me, what fascinates me, and I think where I've really felt I could keep learning, and I've just sort of followed that and see where it takes me.
All right, so I guess we could keep going on and asking Adrian all kinds of other questions because it's so interesting. But I think I would kind of conclude with like a last question that Nick and I really like asking folks that are on in this program, the In Conversation With program. So for all the folks that are watching, what was the one piece of advice you would like to give, which would help them to kind of propel them to become the next Adrian?
That's a great question. Okay, so here's something. So I'm a great believer in kind of like the iterative process and kind of little feedback loops, etc. And I think sort of if there's one thing that kind of like in essence the morning paper is an example of this. It would be sort of like try and learn one new thing every day. It can be a small thing, it doesn't matter. Maybe write it down so that you get a little bit more like, oh, I did it, what was the thing for the day? And if you're really feeling good, maybe share it. But all you're looking for is to get that compound interest thing going. It doesn't have to be much, but it's the regular and little and often, and this habit of, am I learning, am I growing, did I write it down, have I got the evidence? If you do that like every weekday, whatever, for a year, you've got 250 kind of little improvements, little new things you've learned, and just keep it compounding. It doesn't really matter what it is. For so like a habit of, you come down in the morning, you have your coffee, you read or learn something, and you write down what you learned. That's simple as that, but just let it compound.
All right, I'm gonna take out my diary right now and start writing today. The snowball effect. Hopefully, it works out for everyone. So, really appreciate you, Adrian, for your time and having you. It was like really a pleasure and privilege to have you on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I know Nick and I really enjoyed our conversation with you. So yeah, thanks so much.
Brilliant, great chatting to you.